I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. House Democrats have introduced the so-called Equality Act, which would grant civil rights protections based on gender identity and sexual orientation, explicitly at the expense of religious liberty. Andrew Walker of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention joins Colson Center President John Stonestreet to talk about this very real threat to our religious freedoms. But to start the podcast, they share their thoughts on the horrific massacre in New Zealand. Here are John Stonestreet and Andrew Walker.
I want to start our conversation here on the Breakpoint podcast. And my friend Andrew Walker is joining us. And the topic of conversation is the Equality Act, which was introduced last week, something that conservatives have been talking about for a long time. But before we jump into that, Andrew, and I guess I should, introduce you as well. Andrew's the director of research and a senior fellow in Christian ethics at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Andrew, I want to start by talking about New Zealand, just because this is the first time for our Breakpoint audience that we've been able to talk about this. I don't know if you've got any personal connections down there. For me, I started going to New Zealand about 10 years ago. I've probably been down there 8 or 9 times. I have very, very dear friends, mostly on the North Island, but also there specifically in Christchurch, including some folks that are Anglican ministers. And a horrific shooting right now, as you and I talk, 49 people have been killed, specifically targeted in a mosque. We talk about kind of the targeting of innocent life when people are worshiping. We could talk about the Mother Emanuel Church. We could certainly talk about the Jewish Center last year, and now we have a mosque in New Zealand. This is horrific stuff.
It is, and I think it continues to that decline of. I think that the West has traditionally been a place where, regardless of your creed or your ethnicity, you have a place in the West. Our declaration is built on that principle of we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. We all share a common humanity. We might have different religious convictions, but at the root of everyone, even in their religious difference, there's a common humanity. And when episodes like what happened in New Zealand occur, I think it reminds us, first off, of the proclivities of the human heart that's bent towards not sharing and seeing our neighbor as our fellow man and as a partaker of our fellow humanity. But our heart, apart from Christ, is driven towards animus and resentment towards those who are not like us. And so, Christians and Muslims believe exclusively different claims about salvation. But we believe our Muslim neighbors are made in the image of God and are deserving of every ounce of civil liberties and civil protections that all individuals of various religions are entitled to. And so what we saw happen in New Zealand is absolutely horrific. I think it's particularly disgusting and wicked that this would be thrust upon individuals while they're at a time of prayer and religious devotion. They're more or less sitting ducks, so to speak, for this killer. And I don't know all of the so-called manifesto of what the killer has stood for, but it sounds like there was a lot of fear and a lot of anger directed towards the Muslim community. And again, we believe different things than Muslims, but we need to link arms right now out of solidarity, recognizing that an assault on one religion is an assault on all religions.
I appreciate what you said earlier about kind of the Western creed, because this is the irony is in this shooter's manifesto, he talks about kind of the typical white supremacist, we're losing our nation. We're losing the white man's space. We're losing, and one of the perpetrators of this kind of loss is the Muslim community. And so it's kind of this non-Western invasion of Western nations, something that we have seen, repeated by hate groups in the West. Mm-hmm. And yet that's the foundation of kind of the American experience is this idea that all are welcome at the table. Within obviously limits of religious liberty and limits of personal freedoms.
Sure.
Isn't that the irony is that what's driving this is a fear of losing the West. And the West was built on this idea of this e pluribus unum, which we have as one of our national creeds, right? That out of many one. And that to me is just this kind of great irony, is that the
Right.
violence is perpetrated to protect Western civilization in such a way that it denies the very foundation of Western civilization.
That's right. I mean, I think there's this, this big discussion going on in even some Christian intellectual communities about whether kind of the Western tradition, whether liberal democracy is worth preserving, because supposedly Western democracy or liberal democracy, a lot of critics say that its disaster or its unraveling is in its DNA. And, quite honestly, I just completely disagree with that. What I think moments like today show us is not that it's an abuse of liberal democracy, but it is a deviation from liberal democracy. That if you believe what the Western tradition has believed about the primacy of the individual and their relationship to the divine, to God, to the supreme being, that, again, we're going to arrive at different truths about who God is. But the Western tradition has always believed that individuals who are seeking God in earnest and in good faith, they should not feel like they are second-class citizens. They should not feel as though their livelihoods should be threatened, because we all are truth meaning-seeking beings. The Western tradition and liberal democracy has said we're going to give space for individuals to pursue those God-given faculties in order for them to arrive at truth as they best understand it. And so I think when a killer is using religion and using skin color to slice and dice up humanity into different categories, it's obviously an assault on liberal democracy. It's an assault on the image of God. And Christians need to condemn these attacks and understand that an assault on one religion is an assault on all religions. And so we want to stand in solidarity with our Muslim neighbors who might feel threatened and say, we're with you. We have your back in these types of moments.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, we think they're wrong. We think they're very wrong. And that's
Absolutely.
one of the reasons we don't want them killed. We believe that they're made in the image of God and they're valuable, and we want them to find Jesus. And that's one of the great differences between Christianity and other religions, and especially those that corrupt a religion or even live out hateful religions where the one who's wrong has to be killed. Christianity doesn't believe that, not even close.
Right.
We want the sinner to find grace. And what's happened now is something that literally gets in the way of the ability of Christians to point people who are lost to the gospel. And that's a great tragedy in all of this as well. We want those who follow a wrong religion to find Jesus. We because we believe they're inherently valuable. We believe that God loves them. We believe that Jesus Christ died for them. And it's hard. Andrew, I don't know if you've got any personal contacts down there. If you do,
I really don't, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of years ago when I was working with Summit Ministries. David Noble, the founder of Summit, emailed me and said, "Hey, would you like to go speak in New Zealand?" And some speaking requests are more obviously God's will than others, right? And that was an easy
right.
one. And oh my
That's
gosh!
right.
And of course, it's a beautiful place. My wife went down with me. We toured around Christchurch in the South Island when we were down there, and then we just have some of the people that I consider some of my best friends in the world. I mean, they live on the other side of the planet, but we see them every couple years or more, and they're just very dear friends, and others that, of course, social media allows us to keep up to speed with. And when this sort of evil happens, even if it's there's obviously been a kind of a global conflict between radical Islam in the West for a long time. And so this is another chapter, and violence from radical Islam is evil and wrong, and violence from those trying to quote unquote protect Western civilization is evil and wrong. And we've got to be able to walk and chew gum and say both at the same time. Andrew, I want to change the subject to what we were going to talk about today.
Sure.
And this is going to be a little awkward, I think, because, for years, the LGBT movement has put itself in the category of those who have been discriminated against. They've been on the wrong side of violent acts and so on. And that's the narrative. And so in response to that, there's kind of been this looming legislative nuclear option called the Equality Act. Mm-hmm. And, you and I have both written and spoken out against this Equality Act as going way too far for whatever it's trying to fix. and the tail end of saying, look, everybody belongs, within the limits of freedom, within the limits of even religious freedom, everybody belongs in the West. We're saying that the Equality Act isn't the way to do that. And we're going to have to, I think, clearly articulate why these things are different. Can you help us with that?
Yeah. So I think what you said is exactly right, is the Equality Act is in no way a compromise solution to these conflicts between the LGBT community and evangelical Christians. For example, you might think of the cake baker or the florist type scenarios. I think that there are individuals, evangelicals, who are open to a compromise solution. There hasn't been really ideal compromise solutions made available quite yet, but the Equality Act does the very opposite of a compromise solution. It's a winner take all type solution, because the Equality Act takes the categories of sexual orientation and gender identity and elevates them to a protected class in the set of legislation known as the Civil Rights Act from 1964. All of the protections in the various categories in society that it applies to from the 1964 Civil Rights Act are now going to include sexual orientation and gender identity, which means those two categories would be receiving the highest level of federal protection in virtually every area of public life, from public accommodation to public schools to education. Even it would drastically impact Christian education. So it's a very invasive piece of legislation. And somewhat audaciously, the bill specifically weakens the provisions of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It says that RFRA, as was passed in 1993, overwhelmingly, bipartisanly, signed by President Clinton to protect religious liberty at a higher level in our law, does not apply in situations where there's a claim pitting religious liberty versus a claimant who's appealing to the Equality Act as some level of discrimination. And so it's very problematic. There's no compromise. And what this piece of legislation ends up doing is putting Christians on the opposite side of federal law. It says that our viewpoints around marriage and sexuality and how we define male and female, they're not held in goodwill, that they're held in animus, that they're irrational. As I've been telling people, the Equality Act effectively turns Billy Graham into Jim Crow. It doesn't do anything to separate out the idea that people hold convictions in goodwill versus holding them in bad faith. And so I just think this is a piece of legislation that Christians must absolutely oppose if we hope to continue this discussion about whether or not our beliefs and convictions on gender and sexuality have any place left in the public square.
I think that's a really helpful kind of punchline there, Andrew, which is, if the Equality Act elevates sexual orientation and gender identity to the same protections that we see in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, then that really effectively puts Christians, people of conscience, to believe President Obama in 2010 or whenever he said what he believed about marriage being between a man and a woman before he famously evolved, that essentially puts that on the same level as white supremacists. Because, you're on the wrong side of the Civil Rights Act at that point, right?
Absolutely. What the Equality Act does is equates Christian ethics with bigotry. It takes pillars of human history that all of Western society has believed, regardless of whether they are Christians, and makes them akin to racists. Now, we want to be really clear in separating out what is a good view from a bad view. We as Christians would not say that our views are akin to racist views. We would say that racism is absolutely morally repugnant. It's incompatible with Christian ethics and deserves to be on the margins of society. It deserves to be culturally disfavored. But as we know right now, our convictions around these issues of gender and sexuality are increasingly finding themselves on the margins and being culturally disfavored themselves. The difference between our views and racist views is that we don't believe our views are morally repugnant. We think that they're culturally disfavored. And not all culturally disfavored views are morally repugnant. And the Equality Act does not allow that type of differentiation to be understood. And in fact, it does just the opposite. And so it paves over these important conversations and nuances that we need to have as a society if we hope to come to a level of understanding and compromise. To the extent that we are interpreted as racists or holding views like racists, we will be further and further marginalized from society. And I think this is a clarion call for Christians to do their homework and to be better equipped to explain what it is we believe around marriage and sexuality, that they're not based in just faith alone, as important as faith is. They're based in reason. They're fully persuasive. They're rational. And we believe that they lead to human flourishing. And so we just need to do more homework in explaining what it is we believe around these issues.
Yeah, I think that's a really important observation. Is this kind of like is a national debate, and really there's a conversation to be had over whether sexual orientation or gender identity, should fall into the list of identity markers, or that there are at some level behavior markers. And as Christians, we would say, look, your fundamental identity is different. Your behavior sexually is different from your behavior sexually, right? But the Equality Act assumes the answer, kind of telegraphs before the debate's ever been had that sexual orientation and gender identity are the same thing as the color of your skin or your ethnic belonging. I mean, that's huge.
Hi everyone, Shane Morris back with you. We'll get back to John Stonestreet and Andrew Walker in just a moment, but I want to remind you that the Colson Center's annual Wilberforce Weekend is right around the corner, May 17th through 19th in Washington, D.C. This year we ask the question, is Christianity still good for the world? Of course, we think the answer to that question is a resounding yes, and we've invited some great speakers to help us make the case, including Dr. John Lennox, Pastor Rick Warren, rapper and author Jackie Hill Perry, Christian apologist Jeremiah Johnston, and many others. To find out more information or to register, go to wilberforceweekend.org. That's wilberforceweekend.org. I look forward to seeing you there. Now back to John Stonestreet and Andrew Walker.
And let me ask you this, where is this? Because this Equality Act's been kind of looming back there for a long time, and kind of give us, why are we talking about it today? Is because it was reintroduced. So it's kind of back on the table now. So give us kind of the state of things as far as the Equality Act goes. And I mean, I think in the past, it's just kind of like, well, this isn't going to pass. They're not going to be able to push this forward. There's too much at stake. There's too many people that are going to resist. Where are we now on this?
Well, as you said, it's been reintroduced this last week, and it was first introduced in 2015. It had little chance of passing back in 2015. And, quite frankly, the likelihood of the Equality Act being signed into law is extremely, extremely unlikely. So it's worth pointing out to listeners some level of reassurance that it's very, very unlikely that this would ever go into federal law. It's likely to be passed in the House. It has an enormous number of co-sponsors in the House, which is now controlled by Democrats. So I expect a vote sometime in the near future around the Equality Act. It all depends on whether Speaker Pelosi will want to bring attention to this through hearings or not. But what we need to be hoping for right now, and what I think Christians need to be prepared to do, is if this gets its way into the Senate needs to not allow this to come up for a vote. So Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, needs to commit to his constituents and to those concerned about religious liberty that he will not bring this up to a vote. And I think we can be pretty confident that this will not be brought to a vote. I don't think it would pass the Senate. And thankfully, I think President Trump would in no way support this legislation either. So there is optimism and hope around this. The problem, though, is that the Democrats want to use this piece of legislation to kind of get Republicans on the record of whether they're in favor of discrimination or whether you're opposed to discrimination. I mean, this is the whole rhetorical linguistic game of the Equality Act, is that if you're opposed to the Equality Act, you're pro-discrimination, which is just absolutely laughable. But again, it contributes, the Equality Act contributes to the confusion that we're experiencing in society. So we just want to do what we can to make sure this doesn't go forward. We need to do a better job of explaining what is discrimination and what is not discrimination. And again, this bill, it treats Jack Phillips, the cake baker in Colorado, who didn't want to use his talents and creativity to make a same-sex wedding cake. It treats him the same way as it treats someone who would deny an LGBT person a hamburger at a McDonald's. And those situations are extremely different. Every person needs to eat. And that's a separate question of whether or not someone has a right to have a cake with a message that the person making the cake disagrees with. But again, this legislation does not allow for that type of distinction. And that's just one of the many reasons we don't want to see this bill see the light of day.
Well, and to be clear, they have a right to have the cake. They just don't have the right to make everybody who doesn't want to bake the cake.
Yes, that's correct.
On their behalf. Yeah, and I knew that's what you had intended to say, because that's really where this is at, is basically, forcing us to kind of side with views that, are things that are not morally acceptable to Christians. Well, I think it's important that we kind of keep track of this. Of course, what we're saying here, what we're talking about here is a kind of a legislative version of something that we're seeing across the culture in non-legislative ways too, which is you're just not allowed to be here if you hold conservative views when it comes to sex, marriage, and gender. We saw that with the correction you wrote about this in your article at the Gospel Coalition, which, by the way, we'll link to at breakpoint.org. If you click there on the homepage, it says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We'll link to a terrific article that Andrew wrote for the Gospel Coalition entitled "The Equality Act Accelerates Anti-Christian Bias." But you make that connection to what Cynthia Nixon said, that, basically, no, Vice President Mike Pence is not a good guy, and, was basically forcing an apology, that he's insidious because of the views that he holds. We saw this past week. Who's that enormous bodybuilder that's in all those films? Do you know what I'm talking about, Andrew? I don't know if you saw this. This was a Twitter debacle last week.
I don't think I did.
What's the guy's name? Oh, he always makes his pectoral muscles bounce up and down. You know what I'm talking about?
The Rock?
He's enormous. Not The Rock. No, he's an African-American guy. He's huge. What's his name? Oh, man, this is bad. I'm glad this is on podcast and our listeners they're laughing at us for not.
We're supposed to be the culture people, but apparently we're not in tune with culture right now.
Apparently, with these entertainment things, we're not that good. Anyway, he's a guy that was actually, I'll think of his name here, but he was named in the kind of part of the Me Too movement, basically saying that he was sexually abused and so on. So that's kind of where his entree into this whole conversation came. But last week on Twitter, he tweeted something about, kids needing moms and dads.
Yes.
And was just excoriated for suggesting that. And he was suggesting it as a father that his kids need him. But of course, the police officers on social media went after him for basically suggesting that moms and dads are different and that husbands and wives bring different things to the lives of their children. And that's transphobic and that's homophobic. And of course, he backed down. He apologized because that's what people do. But it was a level of intolerance. This wasn't controversial. This is exactly what President Obama said when he said that African-American kids need moms and dads.
Well, not only that, when he famously evolved, he actually tipped his hat to the other side and said that there are people of goodwill who believe what we believe around marriage. And so, as much as I disagree with President Obama's evolution, I do appreciate the fact that he actually, while making the shift, was saying that those who disagree with him are holding their views in goodwill and in good faith. And we should be thankful for that. But tragically, I think that things have progressed to the point that rhetoric like that acknowledges that your opponent might have a decent rationale for holding to the beliefs they do, that's unacceptable. And this is why you can't call Vice President Pence a decent man. This is why Vice President Biden had to apologize publicly for referring to him as a decent man when he was called out by the actress Cynthia Nixon. So I think we're seeing right now before our very eyes the absolute undoing of this kind of Christian common culture and a kind of resurgent militancy around sexual revolution ethics that have been bubbling at the surface for a long time, but there's no pretense anymore. And so I think progressives feel because the culture is at their back, there's no reason to grant a principled compromise or space to people that they think are holding views that are morally abhorrent.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the guy is Terry Crews. I knew I would remember it. Terry Crews. And I actually didn't remember it. I looked it up on Twitter. But, he's on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, I think. And I mean, his Twitter bio says, lover to my wife, father to my children, friend to my friends, and servant to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. A Hollywood actor. And as, again, lover to his wife and father to his children. That's all he said. And he was accused of being homophobic. Well, look, we're almost out of time, Andrew, but I want to bring up one more thing, which is if something like the Equality Act ever goes, there is an attempt, and you mentioned kind of the compromise initiatives from some people who would be on our side of belief, but trying to kind of find a way forward, fairness for all legislation and so on. You and I have both expressed our belief that there's not a compromise that's really available. And one of the reasons is because something like the Equality Act goes through, then it puts the government in charge. If there is such a thing as an exemption, the government gets to decide what the exemption is. And in other words, we saw this with the HHS mandate and the Obama administration that, even being a church isn't enough. You have to be a church who doesn't really have a robust missions program or a free hospital that services or healthcare services like Saddleback does, for example. And the Equality Act would do that is then now, okay, if there is such a thing as exemptions that are carved out for people of faith or for institutions, it certainly is not going to extend to the Barronelle Stutzmans and the Jack Phillips of the world, and probably won't extend when it comes to accreditation to Christian colleges who want to, say, offer degrees in psychology or sociology or anything like that. And we just got a few minutes here left, Andrew, but that's my clear objection to anything that tries to come up with a compromise option. I just don't see that it's there.
Well, I think what you said is fundamentally correct and well said in how you said it. I think what the Equality Act does, it takes the presumption of religious liberty, which is both statutorily protected with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and also constitutionally protected with the First Amendment, and it makes religious liberty the exception rather than the default or the norm. So rather than individuals presuming that when they act in the public square that they have this intrinsic liberty, the Equality Act steps in, paves over the conscience, and says, we'll only let you have liberty in these very few limited instances. So it's actually almost an inversion of the power balance. So when we talk about compromise options, as you mentioned, I would be open to seeing what compromise language would look like. I think one thing it would absolutely have to do is differentiate between views that are held in animus and views that are held in goodwill. It would need to separate out views that are simply culturally disfavored from views that are held in animus, that are morally repugnant. I think it would need to separate out all of the different types of scenarios in the various spheres, whether public accommodation or employment, where this is constituted or defined as discrimination and this is not. The problem is with an approach like that, you end up having kind of a death by 1,000 cuts. And you have a piece of legislation that, hypothetically begins proposing all of these unique scenarios, and public policy is designed and the law is designed to be somewhat, one size fits all. And this type of conflict and discussion we're having culturally does not lend itself to a one size fits all approach. I think it's also worth saying from a Christian perspective, we're not pro-discrimination. We do not want our LGBT neighbors locked out of basic services that we believe that they're entitled to have. So whether that's at a restaurant or at a hotel, no one should be denied medical service because they're LGBT. What we have to do, though, is ask ourselves in all of these situations where there is a conflict, what's being asked of the person whose conscience is feeling conflicted versus how widely available are the services available in a given area where not, for example, in the Jack Phillips situation, there were probably dozens, if not hundreds of other bakers who would be willing to make a cake with a message that's supporting of same-sex marriage. The question is, does Jack Phillips himself have to make that cake? And so we need to have those types of conversations. But again, the Equality Act doesn't allow for that. And I haven't seen any proposed legislation that allows those types of conversations and distinctions to exist either.
My guest today on the Breakpoint Podcast has been Andrew Walker. He's Senior Fellow in Christian Ethics at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the author of a book called God and the Transgender Debate. You can find him on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle, Andrew?
At Andrew T. Walk.
At Andrew T. Walk, and we'll link to all of that. If you come to breakpoint.org, click there on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to this article that Andrew wrote for the Gospel Coalition called The Equality Act Accelerates Anti-Christian Bias, as well as where you can find Andrew's book. Andrew, thanks for kind of helping us think through this. And again, I know this was being able to articulate the difference between discrimination against individuals and the limits of religious freedom and cultural freedoms that we have to draw the line on, and also forcing people of conscience against their will. These are things that our culture doesn't allow us to talk about with this sort of nuance, and it's extremely important that we're able to do that. I also just want to mention, too, that we're recording this on Friday afternoon, just in all fairness. And so the shooting at the mosques in New Zealand, which we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, just happened. And between now and Monday, when this will be posted, is an eternity in terms of the details that might come out. So whatever Andrew and I said is based on our understanding of the facts at hand, which is admittedly somewhat limited. So Andrew, I just want to say thanks. Thanks for joining us on the Breakpoint Podcast.
John, it's great to be with you, and just thankful for you and the Colson Center.
Thanks for listening to today's Breakpoint Podcast with John Stonestreet and Andrew Walker. I do hope you'll consider coming to the Wilberforce Weekend, May 17th through 19th. We have all the information for you at wilberforceweekend.org. I'm Shane Morris, and I hope to see you there.